On my 33rd birthday, my parents spent my money on a beach vacation and sent me a thrift store dress instead. I turned 33 this spring. I finally admitted the distance wasn't just miles. It was a habit that kept me convenient. I worked late nights crunching systems logs in a Boston tower that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition, and my parents lived sprawled across a quiet Tulsa cul-de-sac with my younger brother, Ryan, orbiting like a favored moon. I had been wiring them money for years without writing rules for my own boundaries, convincing myself generosity was love because love had never been evenly measured in our house. I wanted a birthday that didn't feel like a shift I was covering, so I called them 2 months out and asked them to come. Mom answered on the third ring with that soft voice she used when the casserole wasn't set and the church friend was already at the door. I told her the plan slowly, like reading instructions to a skittish animal, and promised flights, a spare room, and a weekend that felt like we were still a family. She went quiet in that old, practiced way that turned a phone into a mirror. I could hear Dad in the background asking what the damage would be, and I pictured him tapping a pen against the kitchen table he always swore he'd refinish. I cut the hesitation off before it hardened into an excuse and said I would pay everything. No catches, no IOUs, no menu of sacrifices attached to the invitation. She said that was generous and that she'd check with Ryan because his semester had demands, which made me bite my tongue since my deposits apparently didn't count as demands. When I called Ryan later, he answered from a parking lot. Engine rumbling, music leaking, and the first thing he asked was whether there would be an open bar, as if hospitality were a tap I could just leave running. He said flights were wild right now and suggested I send him the cash so he could work the timing, because he had alerts set and knew the hacks. He spoke like a discount pilot, confident and a little bored, and the old reflex in me nodded even while the smart part whispered that delegation is a sibling's favorite camouflage. I asked how much would keep me from having to babysit the booking site, and he didn't hesitate, just slid a number across the table of our conversation like a card he'd memorized. 2,800 for the three of them if he timed it right, he said, and another 1,500 for outfits so Mom wouldn't feel like a scarecrow at a city restaurant. I wired it the same afternoon from my phone while standing in the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting a woman who looked competent enough to stop herself and didn't. The transfer confirmation pulsed on my screen like a tiny lifeboat light, and part of me already knew who was being rescued, and it wasn't me. I tried to quiet the pulse of dread with logistics, because logistics always fold neatly when feelings don't. I reserved a long table at a north end spot that smelled like garlic and polished wood and booked a cake tall enough to make a wish without ducking. I set clean sheets in the guest room and opened a window to let the city air work like a promise. I told myself excitement and anxiety share the same heartbeat, and sometimes you have to decide which name to call it. A week drifted by without updates on flights, and I forced myself not to hover because hovering had never earned me anything but the label of demanding. I got the first sharp sign while lining up at a food truck during lunch, staring at a menu that kept misspelling Capri's, when my phone buzzed with a payment request from Ryan labeled Priority Child Fund. The audacity made the euro taste like pennies, and I almost declined with a lecture, yet I swallowed pride like too hot tea and told myself jokes land badly over text, even ones that ring like truth. That night Mom accidentally sent me a screenshot meant for someone else, a picture of my message about finalizing their travel with a caption that read, "She makes enough, she'll cover it. No need for us to stress." I stared at the words until they bled into each other, then put the phone face down and watched the ceiling fan carve the room into pie slices. She unscented a minute later, which felt like someone trying to shove toothpaste back into the tube while pretending it never stained the sink. I still called her the next morning because habit is muscle memory, and she answered like nothing had slipped, telling me it was lovely I was so organized and that Ryan was on it. I said that was good because restaurants charge fees even when the people you love don't show, and she laughed like I'd told a gentle joke about weather. I hung up and noticed my knuckles were white where they clutched the receiver, which felt theatrical for a phone that didn't even have a cord. Work hummed in the background like a second personality I knew how to pilot, and the clarity there made home feel even murkier. My team pinged me with a production issue, and I fixed it in less time than it takes to microwave guilt, then stared too long at the office windows as if my family might be spelled backward in the glare. I told myself this was just pre-trip static and that bones creak before storms pass, yet I could taste the metal of an incoming siren. I sent a gentle nudge to Ryan with options for flight times, pretending I trusted his magic while building a backup plan I prayed I wouldn't need. He replied with a thumbs up emoji and a promise to jump on a drop at midnight, which sounded like folklore with airline fees. I kept planning because planning is just hope wearing a spreadsheet, and I bought candles that smelled like lemon and clean paper because beginnings should smell like you didn't forget yourself. On an impulse that felt like self-defense, I invited extra friends from work and the climbing gym, patting the table with people who showed up every Tuesday without needing a reminder. Their enthusiastic yes hit my inbox like bright marbles, which rolled around the desk of my mood and kept it from tipping. I told them to bring stories instead of gifts because I had enough objects and not enough evidence I mattered to the people I used to set a place for. The second sharp moment arrived on a rainy Thursday when Dad called and asked, with a voice made of gravel and politeness, whether the restaurant had valet because he didn't want to do city parking in his condition. I asked what condition, and he said he'd strained his back lifting a cooler for the neighborhood fish fry, but he'd be fine, which was a sentence that carried 10 pounds of suggestion in a paper bag of guilt. I told him I'd come down and stand in the street myself if it helped him step out of a car, and he laughed in that relieved way that always made me feel like an airbag. That night, while I folded napkins because my hands needed tasks, I practiced the imaginary moment when they would walk into the restaurant, faces travel-tired and softening, and I would forgive the minor bruises of distance the way you forgive a door that sticks. I pictured Ryan hugging me with that one-armed casual thing he does and saying, "Not bad, Boston," like he'd discovered the skyline and decided it could stay. I tried to believe nostalgia could be engineered like uptime. I woke the next morning to no new flight confirmations, only a promotional email from an airline telling me to escape to beaches for less, which felt like a cruel horoscope. I brushed my teeth for too long because mint numbed something, then sent one more message asking for itineraries so I could arrange pick UPS and set my phone screen down again like a superstition. I told myself to breathe because oxygen doesn't care if your family thinks you're a bank. On the train, a little kid in a dinosaur hoodie offered me a sticker shaped like a gold star, and I pressed it to my wallet with a seriousness that made his mother smile. I thought about merit and how some houses hand it out early and others make you earn it until your knees creak. I wondered whether love had ever been a ledger in Tulsa and whether I had balanced it until the ink ran. By the time the afternoon sun turned the office glass into a stage light, I had convinced myself everything was fine because my mind is very good at spray painting word art over holes in the drywall. I picked up the custom cake and could feel its weight like a quiet animal in my arms, and the baker said the inscription looked perfect, which made me want to cry and tip her rent. I carried it home carefully, as if frosting could steady a history. I laid out the guest room with fresh towels and a silly little welcome card because I still believe gestures can hypnotize reality into cooperating. I checked the flight tracker for arrivals that didn't exist and set an alarm to wake me in case they needed a midnight rescue from baggage claim purgatory. I sat on the edge of the bed that wasn't mine and told myself the story about families finding their better angle right when the camera clicks. When the doorbell finally rang the day before the dinner, I felt a thrill that sprinted ahead of thought, and I pictured them on the other side, suitcases scuffed, Ryan rolling his eyes at my enthusiasm. I opened the door ready to forgive anything that could fit inside a hug, and instead found a courier holding a small box with my name on it and a smile that didn't belong to any memory I cherished. I signed for it while my heartbeat tried to hammer a warning into the floorboards, and the courier thanked me with the kind of cheer that makes bad news feel packaged. I set the box on the kitchen counter next to the candles and the guest keys, and the weirdness of the size made the room tilt just slightly. I told myself it was something thoughtful and small because thoughtful and small can be profound when intention is bright. I slit the tape with a butter knife while that alarm in my chest tried to teach me a song I didn't want to learn, and I promised myself this was still the beginning of a good weekend, because sometimes the beginning is the only part you get to choose. I slid the butter knife under the tape and felt cardboard give with a tired sigh, and for a second I imagined tissue paper in a color that meant effort rather than obligation, because sometimes packaging is the last place kindness remembers to hide. I peeled back flaps and met a smell that belonged to basements and cedar blocks rather than celebrations, a sour-sweet thrift odor that climbed my throat and made the lemon candle on the counter feel like it was losing an argument. I lifted out a dress the color of tarnished mustard with sleeves that puffed like a bad memory and a waist bow so stiff it could have steered a boat, and the fabric rasped against my skin like sandpaper pretending to be satin. I told myself maybe it was vintage in the way some things become charming when paired with memory, but then the tag flipped into view on a plastic thread, and the price glared back at me with the quiet cruelty of a cashier's laugh. $12.50 stared from a sticker that still had a handwritten slash through a higher number, and a line beneath announced, "No returns after 7 days," which felt like a prophecy pretending to be store policy. I checked the box for a note and found only a card with my name written too carefully, as if neat print could launder intent that already smelled like mildew. "Happy 33rd. Love you. Can't wait to see pictures," floated in ink that went thin at the end of the line, and the absence of any travel detail hummed like a transformer about to blow. I called Mom with a thumb that shook hatefully at the idea of being dramatic, and the call spun straight into voicemail, where her recorded greeting used a cheerful tone that had always arranged my guilt into neat stacks. I tried Dad next and listened to rings that felt like a hallway I wasn't allowed to enter, then hit Ryan and got a quick decline followed by a text bubble that pulsed without birthing words. My apartment's quiet clicked loudly, and I carried the dress to the sink because instinct said water can sometimes rinse a mistake into something wearable, then stopped when my bank app flashed a fresh alert that didn't belong to any calendar reminder I had lovingly set. A travel agency in Daytona had just charged a deposit using the card I keep strictly for family emergencies, except apparently the definition of emergency had migrated to include ocean view condos with a balcony nobody here had earned. I stared until the numbers arranged into a sentence I could hear, and the sentence said your generosity has been converted into someone else's horizon, which felt poetic until it felt like theft. I scrolled further and found a rideshare receipt titled Airport Transfer with a little palm tree emoji, and the memo line said Spring Break Kickoff because even thieves enjoy their captions. I tried Mom again because I wanted to give Grace one last chair at the table, and the call slid to voicemail, while my phone vibrated with a new message from her that had been written like a landlord posting a notice rather than a mother sharing good news. "That's your present," came first, clipped as a fingernail and twice as personal, followed by "We used the travel money to send Ryan to Florida because he needs the break and he's our priority right now. And it would be selfish to drag him to a stressful city weekend when he's overwhelmed." I read the word priority until letters blurred, then read the phrase selfish until I could taste iron, and the betrayal didn't arrive with fireworks so much as with a heavy coat I had worn before without naming it. A beat later, Ryan finally offered words, sending a photo of his feet in sand and a plastic cup with a lime wedge, and he typed, "Don't be weird. We'll FaceTime during the cake," which managed to be both breezy and cruel with unforgivable economy. I replied with a single word that tasted like pennies and restraint, writing "all right," while deleting 3 paragraphs that wanted to prosecute every year I had paid silence as if it were rent. The quiet landed like a judge's gavel, and a second new alert hit my inbox from the airline confirming travel insurance purchased under my email for passengers who were definitely not landing in Boston, which meant my kindness had bought them peace of mind in case their good time got rained on. I sat down because my knees suddenly believed in gravity, and while I sat I noticed a receipt tucked into the dress's inner seam, a faded strip pinned by a safety stitch like a secret someone trusted a stranger to ignore. The receipt belonged to a church charity shop half an hour from my parents' place, and the timestamp was noon of the same day I had wired the last chunk for their outfits, which turned thrift into punctuation rather than necessity. Under the receipt, a little square of paper fell out with the clerk's scrawl saying "Final sale. No steaming. Smells may linger," and I laughed in a way that made my neighbor knock through the wall, because hysterical has a particular acoustics in old buildings. I told him everything was fine because explaining rot through drywall seemed like an act of intimacy we hadn't earned, and I placed the dress on the table as if it deserved to witness what came next. The first sharp phone call arrived from an unknown number that turned out to be Dad using a co-worker's cell, and his voice carried the elasticity of a man trying to stretch a thin blanket over a queen-size disaster. He said your mother meant well, and Ryan has been under a strain because midterms are brutal this year. And I wondered if he remembered I had taken midterms once without beaches, cocktails, or a sister's peril. He asked me not to post anything embarrassing because the church committee is sensitive about family image, and the request sat inside my chest like a hot coin I couldn't spit out without burning my tongue. I told him I would not be weaponizing social media because I didn't need an audience to name theft, then realized I was lying to both of us because humiliation is a solvent, and sometimes you need stain remover. The second sharp moment came from work when a junior teammate sent a Slack message asking whether I had canceled the office cake for Monday because the bakery called to confirm I still wanted the gold script, and I remembered how many ceremonies people can ruin without even showing up. I typed yes, the cake stays, while my cursor hovered over a different sentence that wanted to scream into a channel that was never designed to hold family history. I set my phone on Do Not Disturb since disturbance had already won, and I picked up the dress with 2 fingers like a lab tech evaluating a weird sample, then laid it across the back of a chair and watched the sleeves deflate as if the garment could be shamed. I made tea I didn't want and stared at steam that knew how to rise without asking permission. And a plan clicked together with a gentleness I didn't trust. Because sometimes a plan feels like mercy when it's actually a lever. I took careful photos of the dress with the tag visible and the charity receipt tucked in the corner like a caption, then placed the box next to the lemon candles I had bought to send a room my family would now not be entering. I didn't post yet because timing shapes truth as much as facts do, and I wanted the light to be right so the story could finally be seen rather than argued. When twilight hit the windows, the city turned reflective, and I could see myself doubled as I framed the shot, a woman holding evidence that love had been itemized all along. My phone buzzed again with a group text from my parents' number that included a link to a beachside restaurant and a line that said, "Look, we found a place with live music. Wish you were here," which could have been funny if it weren't a confession in a Hawaiian shirt. I typed nothing because silence finally felt like a tool rather than a punishment, and I opened my bank's card controls and slid the toggle that turns generosity into a locked door without hinges. The final sting of the evening came when Mom sent one more message that tried for tenderness and landed on condescension, telling me not to spiral and to remember that family decisions are complicated when resources are limited, and that I should be proud I can contribute without keeping score. I thought about scoreboards and how they exist to count what happened even when the home team doesn't like the numbers, and I placed my phone face down as if blackout cloth could make a theater forget its show. I washed my hands like the dress had been contagious and stood at the window long enough to memorize the streetlights, then sat with a notebook and wrote 2 columns labeled, "Keep Giving" and "Stop Now." And I watched the second column fill with sentences that tasted like oxygen. Before bed, I texted Ryan one more time because a younger version of me insisted on a final appeal, asking for the flight confirmations so I could arrange airport pickups just in case miracles were still on sale. He replied with a sunburned selfie holding a hollowed pineapple like a trophy and a line that said, "Relax, we'll toast you from the pier," and the ease in his face answered a different question than the one I had asked. I put the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling while the building settled around me, and I decided I would not cry in a room I had prepared for guests who had chosen waves over chairs. I fell asleep with the box still open on the counter and the dress draped like an accusation, and I woke near midnight to a promotional email from the condo complex reminding guests to tag them for a chance to win another weekend. And I laughed, because even marketing understood how reward follows audacity. I wrote one word back to Mom at 2 in the morning when my anger cooled into something metallic and precise, and the word was all right, because consent withdrawn sometimes sounds exactly like surrender until the switch flips. I set an early alarm not for an airport run, but for a decision I could make with daylight, and I closed my eyes knowing the turning point had arrived wrapped in yellow fabric and a price sticker that never belonged on love. When the day of my birthday finally arrived, I forced myself to act like the sting from their thrift store gift had already faded because I refused to let anyone at the party smell the disappointment on me. The apartment buzzed with warm laughter, music, and the smell of rosemary bread I had baked that morning, and for a while, I managed to lose myself in the rhythm of it all. My friends filled the kitchen with overlapping stories and the kind of easy teasing that only comes from years of knowing exactly which buttons to press without drawing blood. I caught myself glancing at the door more often than I wanted to admit, imagining the moment my parents and Ryan might suddenly appear, laughing about some travel delay, but the hours stretched thin without a knock or even the polite fiction of a text saying they were sorry. Halfway through slicing the cake, my phone buzzed, not with an apology, but with a photo notification from Ryan. The image was of him shirtless on a Florida beach, sunglasses tilted low, holding a neon drink so tall it looked like it required a building permit. The caption read "Spring Break Vibes," with a winking emoji, and I realized then that the money I had sent for flights, hotel, and clothes had bought them a vacation I wasn't invited to. I put the phone down as calmly as if it were an oven mitt, then walked back into the living room, where my best friend Jonah was already lighting candles on the cake like he sensed I needed a distraction. Later that night, after the guests had drifted out into the winter chill, I stood in the dim light of my kitchen, the ugly dress draped across a chair like a sleeping animal I didn't trust. The thrift store tag still dangled, its numbers sharp against the soft yellow of the fabric, And in that moment, I decided the world would see it exactly as I had received it. I set the dress on my coffee table, arranged the tag so the price was front and center, and took a photo that caught every wrinkle and every dull glint of its cheap buttons. I posted it to my social feed with a single caption: "When you send $4,300 for travel and party clothes, but this is the gift." The reaction was immediate and vicious. Comments stacked up faster than I could read them. Friends demanding names, acquaintances tagging their own relatives in outrage, even a few strangers sharing the post like it was a modern parable about misplaced loyalty. By midnight, my mother called, her voice tight and sharp, accusing me of humiliating the family, claiming I had no right to air private matters in public. I told her calmly that if they wanted privacy, they could have kept my money and their thrift store finds off my doorstep. She sputtered something about Ryan's mental health and how he needed a break from the stress of adulthood, as if adulthood were a punishment I had somehow escaped rather than something I had been paying for on their behalf. 2 days later, my father called from an unfamiliar number, probably to bypass the block I had put on his phone after his last shouting match with me. He said I was being cold, that Ryan's education and their mortgage were family obligations I had agreed to when I started sending them money years ago. I told him obligations go both ways, and that I was ending every penny of financial support starting now. His tone changed instantly, from coaxing to venom, and he said if the house was lost or Ryan dropped out, it would be my fault. I reminded him that my parents were both physically able to work full-time, and that maybe the real shame was how comfortable they had become treating me like a wallet with a pulse. That week, I walked into my HR office and asked to redirect the portion of my paycheck that had always gone into my parents' account straight into a new high-interest savings account under my name. The relief that washed over me was almost dizzying, as if I'd been holding my breath for years without realizing it. Meanwhile, the messages from home became increasingly desperate. Emails from my mother at 3 in the morning, voicemails from Ryan accusing me of ruining his future, even a letter from a distant aunt telling me to do the right thing before it's too late. I deleted each one without opening it. The night after I made my final transfer into my own account, I stood on my balcony overlooking the street, the city lights glimmering like something I could actually claim as mine. I realized the party, the dress, the online storm, they were only the surface ripples of something deeper. What I had really done was break the pattern that had kept me tethered to people who measured love in bank deposits. And once that cord was cut, there was no going back. 3 weeks passed before the inevitable knock came, heavy and insistent, the kind that carries the weight of entitlement instead of politeness. I looked through the peephole and saw all three of them. My mother with her arms folded like she was about to lecture a student, my father with that slack-jawed look of practiced disappointment, and Ryan standing behind them with his sunglasses pushed up like he'd just returned from a leisurely brunch rather than a cross-country flight. I opened the door just wide enough to lean against the frame, and before I could speak, my mother swept past me into the apartment as if she still held the deed. My father followed without meeting my eyes, and Ryan came last, wearing a sweatshirt that read, "Life's a Beach," which almost made me laugh in spite of myself. They didn't sit. My mother began talking before I had even closed the door, telling me the bank had called about the mortgage and that if I didn't resume my commitments immediately, they would be facing foreclosure within months. She spoke like a CEO demanding budget allocations from a subordinate, only pausing to allow my father to add that Ryan's tuition balance was now past due. Ryan finally chimed in with the gall to say I was jeopardizing his future and that I owed it to him to see him through his senior year. I asked if he remembered FaceTiming me from a Florida bar while I served cake to my friends, and his silence was answer enough. I told them flatly that my financial support ended the day they chose a vacation over my milestone birthday, and that I had no intention of reversing that decision. My father's face flushed a deep, mottled red, and he accused me of letting money ruin our family, as if the ruin hadn't started years ago when they began treating my paychecks as their safety net. My mother's voice rose an octave, claiming I was being vindictive and that families don't keep score. I reminded her that she was the one who used the word priority, making it clear where I ranked in her own ledger. The argument spiraled. My father insisted they were too old for full-time work, my mother complained about her aching knees, and Ryan stood there shifting his weight, looking anywhere but at me. I finally walked to the door, opened it wide, and told them to leave my home. They hesitated, as if waiting for me to soften, but when I stepped forward, they shuffled out with muttered complaints. Ryan turned at the last second like he was about to say something important, but I shut the door before he could speak. I leaned against the door, my hands trembling from adrenaline, and realized it was the first time I had physically pushed back against them. The apartment felt different, lighter somehow, like the air had been rearranged in my favor. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch, letting the silence settle like a warm blanket. No one was taking anything from me tonight, and that alone felt like a celebration. Over the next few months, the updates came secondhand through cousins and old neighbors. My parents had found full-time jobs for the first time in decades, and they complained to anyone who would listen about how exhausting it was. Ryan, I heard, had taken 2 part-time jobs to cover his tuition and had dropped all but one elective so he could manage the workload. A part of me thought I might feel guilty hearing that, but the guilt never arrived. Instead, I felt an unfamiliar pride in finally forcing them to live in the reality they'd so often outsourced to me. I started noticing small but tangible changes in my own life. My savings account grew every month, and for the first time since I'd moved to the city, I began seriously looking at condos instead of rentals. I bought a new winter coat without checking the price tag twice, and I booked a weekend trip with friends simply because I could. The absence of their constant demands left space for other people. People who gave without expecting receipts and who remembered my birthday without needing reminders. Sometimes a cousin would try to play mediator, calling to say my parents missed me or asking if I could extend an olive branch. I would ask if they'd heard about the dress, and when they said no, I would send the photo, the wrinkled yellow fabric, the price tag, the thrift store receipt. The reaction was always the same. A sharp inhale, a muttered curse, and finally, "You're doing the right thing." It became my quiet proof that I hadn't lost my mind, that the story was exactly as I remembered it. Even so, there were nights when I would wonder if this stalemate was permanent. I would think about calling, about asking them why they thought any of it was acceptable. But the moment I imagined their answers, the phone stayed on the table. They had shown me exactly how little they valued me beyond what I could provide, and I had no interest in giving them the chance to repackage that as love. The turning point came one rainy Saturday morning when I saw their names on the caller ID again. My finger hovered over the screen, but instead of answering, I let it ring out. I had learned something in the months since I stopped paying their bills. You can't rebuild trust with people who still see you as currency. And until that changed, the door, both literal and metaphorical, was going to stay shut. 6 months after that last confrontation, I was finally living in a rhythm that felt entirely my own, where my mornings belonged to coffee steam and quiet news headlines rather than surprise calls about overdue bills. I had found a condo with wide windows and enough space to host people I actually wanted around, and every week that passed made the old version of my life feel like a dream someone else had dreamed for me. Then, one Thursday evening, I opened my mailbox and found a thick envelope stamped with the name of a law firm in Tulsa, a city I hadn't set foot in since I was 18. I carried it upstairs with the same unease you feel holding a box that rattles in the wrong way. Inside was a letter on heavy cream paper explaining that my great-aunt May, a woman I barely knew beyond awkward Christmas conversations, had passed away 2 months earlier, leaving her entire estate to me alone. The number on the page made me sit down immediately. Just over $400,000 in cash and assets, along with a small lake house in northern Arkansas. My breath caught not just at the amount, but at the handwritten note included with the will, a note that had clearly been written long before her death. "I've seen you give to people who only ever take," it read in her narrow, careful handwriting. "This is for you, and you alone. Promise me you won't share it with anyone who made you feel small." I sat there holding that paper like it might vanish if I blinked, because suddenly the years of quiet resentment had been inverted into something like justice. But the strangest part came less than an hour later, when my phone lit up with a message from Ryan. It was his first attempt at contact since the day I pushed them all out of my apartment. "Hey," it said, "can we talk? Something important." I didn't respond, but I knew the timing wasn't coincidence. Someone had told them. The following Sunday, there was a knock at my door, not the pounding entitlement of before, but a softer rhythm, almost tentative. When I opened it, my parents stood there without Ryan, each holding a folder of papers. My father spoke first, saying they'd fallen behind on everything: mortgage, utilities, even property taxes, and that the house would be gone within 2 months unless they could get a significant infusion of funds. My mother said they'd been foolish before and wanted to start over as a family, but she kept glancing at my hands like she was trying to see if I was holding a checkbook. I told them I had received Aunt May's letter, and that I planned to honor her request in full. My father frowned as if I had misread it, but I repeated every word aloud, slowly, so they could hear the part about not sharing it with anyone who had made me feel small. My mother's face hardened, and for a moment I thought she might actually argue that they hadn't done that, but then she looked down at her shoes. Without another word, I stepped back inside and closed the door, letting the lock click like punctuation. 3 days later, I listed the lake house for sale and wired the proceeds straight into a retirement account under my name only. That night, another envelope arrived. This one slipped under my door with no stamp, containing nothing but the thrift store receipt for the dress, folded in half, with a single line written on the back, "You'll regret this." The handwriting was Ryan's. I laughed longer than I should have, the sound bouncing off the walls until it almost didn't sound like me anymore, because the truth was I wouldn't regret it for a single second. If anything, I wished I'd walked away years earlier. Still, sometimes late at night, I wonder how that receipt made it back to me. Did they keep it all this time as a souvenir of the day they decided I was expendable, or did they find it recently, tucked away in some drawer where guilt doesn't quite reach? Either way, it sits now in the back of my own desk, not as a threat, but as a reminder. A reminder that I am no longer their safety net, no longer their silent bank, and no longer anyone's afterthought. And if that ending wasn't what they expected, then perhaps for once, the surprise belonged entirely to me.